Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Gavigan, and I am a PhD student in art history here at the University of Oklahoma. Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Gavigan, and I am a PhD student in art history here at the University of Oklahoma. I am going to be talking to you today about Hans Holbein the Younger, a German artist, and his creation of the image of Henry VIII. I'd like to start with an excerpt from a book called The Lives of the Illustrious Netherlandish and German Painters by a 17th century art historian by the name of Carl van Mander. In Van Mander's book, he tells a somewhat infamous story about Holbein at the court of King Henry VIII in England. It happened that on a certain occasion an English earl came to visit Holbein because he desired to see his works of art. For Holbein, who was painting something from life or doing something private, this was most inconvenient. He therefore refused the earl very courteously 2 or 3 times and requested him to pardon the refusal as he was otherwise engaged. But whatever friendly and humble arguments Holbein used, the earl would not put off and insisted against his wishes to come up the stairs at all costs, because he felt that his person should be treated with more honor and respect by a painter. Holbein, having warned him to stop his insolent rudeness, took hold of the earl and threw him down the stairs. While his noblemen and servants, upset by the dreadful fall, were busy taking care of their lord, Holbein securely locked and barricaded the door to his chamber and climbed out of a window and hurried into the presence of the king and sought forgiveness. The king pardoned him on the condition that he should tell him what the misdemeanor or cause of the matter was. And when Holbein had done that frankly and completely, the king pretended to be very sorry that he had pardoned him so easily, telling him that he must not dare to commit such impudence again. Shortly afterward, the earl arrived. In a miserable state, wounded and bandaged, he behaved very pitifully and complained in a soft, feeble voice about the painter who had treated him thus, whereby he only partially told the truth of the matter, and out of spite made it a good deal worse with lies to the detriment of Holbein, as the king could readily tell. When the earl had finished complaining, he desired that his majesty should therefore impose a richly earned punishment suitable to the ill treatment done to his person. As it looked as if the king was not inclined to punish the incident according to his wishes, he intimated that he would take his own revenge. Thereupon the king became angry, and he said, "Do you think this man means so little to me? I tell you, Earl, that I can make 7 earls, if it please me, from 7 peasants. But I could not make one Hans Holbein, or so excellent an artist, out of 7 earls." So Van Mander's biography provides us with this early attempt to understand Holbein's place in the history of Renaissance painting in England. The work is brief, and it's written as a second-hand account and does not contain many original facts about the artist's life or practices. However, Van Mander's biography does provide at least one significant message, that of the highly regarded opinion of the artist in England. Whether wholly accurate or not, the story I just quoted speaks as a symbol of Holbein's status in Henry VIII's court and suggests his impact on Tudor history exceeded that of mere court painter. Hans Holbein's English portraits confirm Van Mander's suggestion, as we'll see. They reveal the artist's keen observations and critiques of the tumultuous events taking place around him. These social critiques manifested themselves through the artist's technique, his use of iconography, and his design choice in his portraits. The political atmosphere at the court of Henry VIII differed drastically from that in Holbein's native Germany. Whereas in Germany, many small ruling enclaves were scattered across the country, London was the social center of England, and the court was the very heart of it all. Once Holbein reached London, he almost immediately found himself at the center of the realm, giving him access to key figures in the court of Henry VIII. In fact, his first commissions portrayed two of the most prominent men at the king's court, Sir Thomas More and Sir Henry Guilford, of whose portrait we will look at here in a moment. As Holbein's career progressed at court, he witnessed and in ways often directly participated in many of the important events of Henry VIII's reign. He saw the rise and fall of Anne Boleyn, Sir Thomas More, and Thomas Cromwell. He saw Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church and become the supreme leader of his own Church of England. And Holbein was in England for the annulment of two of Henry's marriages, the beheading of two of his queens, the death of another, and the marriage to the last, who managed to survive both king and painter. Our knowledge of the reign of Henry VIII is largely due in part to Hans Holbein, including the image of the king himself. Holbein's portraits offer more than the mere likeness of the sitter. They reveal critique and social commentary of the reign. Holbein was greatly influenced by the behaviors and practices of the humanist movement that had taken root in England. He was a careful observer of life and human nature, and he documented history and created social commentary through his portraits. And the study of humanism provided Holbein the opportunity to enter into a dialogue with the surrounding events that manifested itself in his portraiture. Today, we will be looking at the overall image that Hans Holbein created of King Henry VIII, along with a few other portraits by Holbein at the court. The artist created relatively few portraits for the king himself, but what he did create was of high importance. These portraits that we look at are going to revolve around the creation of this particular mural, a large mural that Hans Holbein painted for Whitehall Palace. This is what we would call a dynastic mural. It features several generations and was ultimately meant to convey the power of the Tudor dynasty in England. What we are looking at here is actually a copy of the original mural that Holbein created. The original mural was destroyed by fire in 1698. But it is believed that the original mural was actually painted in 1537. In this copy, which corresponds actually with a brief description that Van Mander, the historian that I quoted from at the beginning of this lecture, and it corresponds with his description of the painting. And his description includes the date of 1537, which is why we know the approximate date of this mural. In the mural, we see Henry VIII himself standing with his father, Henry VII, behind him. And then on the other side of the mural are both queens, the wives of both of these kings. So at the top is Elizabeth of York, who is Henry VIII's mother, and below her is Jane Seymour, who is Henry VIII's third wife, but her significance is that she was the only wife to produce a legitimate male heir for the king, and that being sort of the unseen third portion of the dynasty, the third generation of the dynasty. The mural itself was created presumably at the end of a long semi-public room at Whitehall Palace. And the positioning of it is such that a viewer could stand at the entrance, the door to the room, and take in the entire width of the painting in one glance. Um, the composition and the positioning of the painting may have been designed to provide this exact view. Um, the wall painting, in a sense, then kind of creates this illusion that the viewer is actually in the space with these four royal figures. Um, and then the decorative scheme of the painted room may have extended the actual decorative scheme of the room that it was in, again, providing this sort of illusionary experience with this mural. Uh, the figures in the painting themselves are very close to life size, suggesting again that they and the space around them were intended to kind of trick viewers into believing that they were in the presence of the royal family themselves. Uh, and then the focus of this mural is this large tablet in the center of the space in which the four figures are around, with Henry VIII and his Queen Jane Seymour kind of serving as the bookends and the frame to this particular tablet, which is also the tablet itself talks about the date of the creation, and it also talks about the foundation of the Church of England, which Henry VIII founded. So it's very significant in that. What we are looking at here is a to-scale portion of a preparatory drawing that Hans Holbein created for this mural. We are seeing the actual section of the mural that features Henry VIII and then his father, Henry VII, behind them. This is the only portion of the original work that remains to date. Aside from this, the only way we really know what this mural potentially looked like is from the copy that we saw from over 100 years later, and also from some written accounts of people who visited Whitehall before it was destroyed by fire. In particular, Van Mander, who we mentioned, who, aside from that just early description of Holbein himself, Van Mander's only mention of this particular mural is that it was overwhelming and made an impression on people when they entered the hall where it was. There's also a diary by a visitor named Baron Waldstein from Moravia, who visited Whitehall in 1600, which mentions the presence of Holbein's painting, including the tablet figure in the middle. And then there is another mention of the painting in 1613 by the Duke of Saxe-Weimar visiting Whitehall, and he commented that that there was a room in Whitehall with full-length depictions of Henry VIII and his father, Henry VII. This painting by Hans Holbein is of Henry VIII is slightly earlier than the mural, and is potentially a basis for the image of the king that was created in the mural. Holbein, we will be looking at this particular painting in relationship to the mural throughout this discussion as well. As we can see from this painting of Henry VIII, Holbein was skilled at imparting realism, detail, and as we will go on, you will, I hope, come to understand social commentary as well in his portraits. And certainly his creation of the image of the king would be no different. To begin to examine Holbein's techniques, his use of iconography, And then his use of social critique in his English portraits, which will eventually come together to help create this image of Henry VIII, will actually begin about 10 years earlier with these two portraits, Sir Henry Guilford, who I mentioned earlier, and his wife, the Mary Woolton, the Lady Guilford. These are both from 1527. This commission marked the beginning of Holbein's career in England and also established the artist's program of intent that would evolve in future works, including Henry VIII. Guilford was not only one of Holbein's first English patrons, but among the first to recognize the use of his talent for a kind of propaganda, a talent that would be key to Holbein's success in England in the coming years. Henry Guilford provided a strong start to Holbein's career in England. He was a powerful and favorite courtier to Henry VIII. And in fact, Guilford and Henry had been close since childhood when Henry's father, Henry VII, was king. About 2 years the king's senior, Guilford moved up through the ranks of the royal household until by 1527, the years of these portraits, he was comptroller, which is one of the highest and closest positions to the king. So Guilford clearly fit well into the court in those early years. Guilford was the first in a line of patrons who recognized in Holbein the capacity to display a stunning likeness in portraiture, while also showing the patron's power and wealth. Up until Holbein's arrival, the practice in England of collecting works of art was merely as an accumulation of material objects, a show of power through a magnificent collection of paintings and sculpture. Tudor courtiers would have had no level of discernment for art beyond the awareness of the expense of the pieces. Guilford, on the other hand, recognized that Holbein's value lay beyond this. To visually portray the Guilford's power through the portraits themselves and not just by possessing them. The Guilford portraits would have been very expensive from commission to creation. On first glance, this would appear to represent the sitter's intentions in the commissions. The portraits include a lavishly designed background as opposed to the less expensive option of a solid color. The clothing of both Henry Guilford and Lady Guilford are exquisitely crafted from expensive cloth of gold and are also depicted to the finest detail in the portraits. Holbein even used real gold in the paint to emulate the high quality and cost of the wardrobe itself. Lady Guilford is shown with 6 gold chains across her bodice, a necklace and a choker with jeweled pendants, and at least 3 gold rings. The Guilfords' elaborate costuming and jewels, depicted in minute detail, allowed them to proclaim their wealth and their status. In the resulting portraits, there is a display of wealth and, in turn, power to a level that was seldom portrayed except in portraits of royalty. Guilford was not of royal blood, so he may have felt the need to display his power and wealth in response to a perceived threat to his position. This specific threat materialized with the beginnings of dissension at the court over the king's relationship with Anne Boleyn. Holbein's portrait of Guilford combined an excessive display of wealth, the persona of a very serious man with the staff and jewels of his earned ranks in the king's service, and the huge bulk of the sitter's body to create a vision and a statement of power. Guilford's opposition to the king's divorce from his first wife, Queen Catherine, would lead to the courtier's resignation just a few years after these portraits were completed. Despite the disagreement on this, the touchiest of subjects to the king, Guilford managed to remain in favor until his death in 1532. The portrait of Henry Guilford was one of Holbein's earliest in England, and from even a cursory examination can be seen to create a dialogue beyond a simple portrayal of a person. The wealth and power displayed certainly reflect the sitter's intentions with the commission. However, the intentions of the artist are also present, and both Guilford's portrait and his wife's can be read from this perspective. Holbein's commentary runs deep throughout both portraits and turns to critique when the two portraits are considered in conjunction with each other. We see that there are certain elements that appear to tie the two portraits together. For example, Holbein included a blue background with vinery in both. In addition, a rod across the top of both of images suggests that the curtain behind Henry Guilford could slide into Mary's face. However, a closer look at each of the apparent similarities reveals them to have little to do with connecting husband to wife. Beginning with the vines that appear in the background of each portrait, the vines appear sturdy, like grapevines, yet with a leaf more like a fig. The vines in Lady Guilford act to balance and frame the composition, while in her husband's portrait they appear merely to fill the space rather than to act as a compositional element. The vines do not resemble each other in pattern or usage from one portrait to the next. In Lady Guilford's portraits, the vines curve around the outline of her body in a sinuous fashion, ending delicately and trailing off just above her headdress. Contrarily, in Henry's portraits, the vines do not really seem to be vines at all, but random leaves of foliage lost behind the bulk of the figure. The sitter's body overwhelms the vines so that they offer little to the composition. Further, Holbein used the same fig-like foliage in multiple other portraits painted during his time in England. And art historian Susan Foister, who is the author of the chapter portion that I have assigned to go with this lecture, Foister concluded that the vines are artificial and evocative and unlikely to have any literal meaning. In fact, given that Holbein used the vines on multiple portraits, the inclusion could be an artistic device to represent authorship. Holbein rarely signed his works. Instead, he may have used ornamental devices like the vines to represent his identity. Another visually connecting element in the portraits is the curtain and the rod in the background of Henry Guilford. The curtain hangs on a rod that appears to continue into the portrait of Lady Guilford and rests on the capital of one of the columns behind her. In Henry's portrait, a tiny fragment of a similar column appears in the upper right corner. This fragment does seem to support the rod in a similar fashion to that seen in Lady Guilford. However, the curtain rod motif acts in a similarly incongruous manner to the vines. In Henry Guilford's portrait, the rod serves a purpose. It is holding up the green the drape that frames and balances the figure in the composition. In the portrait of Mary, on the other hand, the rod is an architectural tie rod in the Italian manner, differentiating it from the curtain rod in Sir Henry Guilford's portrait. In addition, the rod rests on top of a column that otherwise should be holding up a pediment or some other architectural detail, rendering the column itself useless. Therefore, the rods, with their two different functions, can only be two different rods and do not actually tie the pictures together. Now, if we consider a somewhat deeper examination of the elements in the lady's portrait, these support the idea that hers is an independent image and not a companion to her husband's. First, Lady Guilford's full face depiction, in contrast to her husband's slight profile, was a compositional choice that was actually a favorite of Holbein's, as it suited his ability to show a sitter's individuality and their character, which will be important in our discussion a little bit later in this lecture. However, the result of this technique in Lady Guilford has kind of the opposite effect. The face that gazes out at the viewer is bland, and with very little deviation in tone or color and almost no emotional expression. The viewer then sees a portrait totally devoid of character. Holbein often created drawings of his subjects that he would then use to transfer to the panel as a guide for the finished portrait. This was the pattern of work that he followed for the creation of the Guilford portraits as well. Holbein's preliminary drawing of Henry Guilford shows the subject represented nearly identically to the finished work. The artist slightly slims the face, but other than that, Guilford appears relatively unchanged from his sketch. Lady Guilford, however, appears quite differently in the sketch that Holbein created compared to her finished portrait. While the shape of her body and face, her dress, and her headdress remain basically unchanged, there is a striking difference in her gaze and her expression. Interestingly, the preliminary sketch that Holbein made of Lady Guilford shows her in a slight profile. If Lady Guilford remained the same in the finished portrait as Holbein represents her in the drawing, then she would look towards her husband with a coy smile if the two were hung side by side. The drawing shows Lady Guilford to be alive, warm, and even connected to her husband. The alterations remove these characteristics of her personality. It's likely that Henry Guilford requested the changes, desiring a more pious-looking depiction of his wife. Holbein's first image represents a woman too sensual and too real for 16th century English decorum. As we know, the eyes speak volumes of a sitter's character. While Henry looks out and to the side of his portrait, his straight-ahead gaze is it's a strong and direct depiction of a man. Lady Guilford, with her eyes cut to the side, displays an entirely different persona. While also gazing out of the side of the drawing, the result is flirtatious and even devious. Holbein's drawing of Lady Guilford displays exactly the level of talent for which he was becoming known. He captured her personality and individuality, giving life to his sitter. Such character, however, may have been Guilford's problem with the drawing. He wanted a virtuous wife, not one full of character. This was not an uncommon issue in portraiture in the 16th century. Art historian Gabrielle Langdon, in her book Medici Women, explains how noble women were posed frontally in portraits to eliminate any sense of eroticism, since a portrait could have the ability to set the heart on fire. The advances in the use of oil pigments in portraiture added luster to an image that could also increase the viewer's enchantment with the subject, and even the portrait itself could cause the viewer to fall in love with the subject. This notion could have prompted Guilford to fear that his wife's sensual look, combined with Holbein's incredible mastery of technique with paint, would create a recipe for a reputation of ill repute for his wife. This was an especially well-founded fear, taking into consideration the atmosphere of the court in 1527. Anne Boleyn was gaining power at the court of Henry VIII as his mistress. The king filed his petition with the Pope, seeking an annulment from Queen Catherine so he could marry Anne. The common view of Anne was that of a whore, and this was a view that Guilford likely shared. While Guilford supported the king in many ways, he was totally opposed to the annulment. He was even rumored to have said that he wished all those who were arguing for the king's annulment could be shipped to Rome and be exposed for the charlatans that they were. Guilford clearly viewed Anne as a vile threat to Queen Catherine and to England. As a man in a position of power, he would have been very eager to portray a sense of decorum in the face of the changes that all could sense were approaching in England. Therefore, he likely asked Holbein to change her gaze to the front to eliminate her smile. Taking such changes into consideration, had a pendant pair or a portrait pair been the original intent, there would have been little danger of any interpretation other than that of a devoted wife bound to her husband. Instead, Guilford likely commissioned the portrait of Mary as a standalone image, a more public statement of his wife's piety and an example of Guilford's wealth, power, and virtue. Now that we've spent some time with the Guilfords and their portraits, we should return then to considering them as precursors to Holbein's imagery of Henry VIII. In this slide, we can see the portrait of Henry Guilford in between two of the images of Henry VIII that Holbein created that we have looked at. And I think that we can see striking similarities in these portraits, in all three at this point. In addition to the similar gaze, all three are looking at an angle in a partial profile to the outside of the portrait. Costuming is very similar, as is the fashion of high royalty at the Tudor court at this time, but also the breadth of the bodies in each of these figures is very similar. And you can almost see how Holbein could have taken an earlier work that he was commissioned to do and been able to translate the techniques that he honed in that work to do what was probably his most important commissions in Tudor England, those for the king himself. We can see the similarities in the costumes, but also looking at this very marked similarities in the poses in each of these three portraits. The hands are nearly identical, maybe holding slightly different objects or resting in slightly different ways, but in each portrait, one hand is at the waist holding something and the other hand is lowered slightly below, either hooked on the belt, as in Henry Guilford's picture, or holding something like the knife in the full-length portrait, or just out of frame in the color portrait that we have here. But perhaps even more remarkable as a comparison in the Guilford portraits is actually with Lady Guilford's portrait and the changes that were made. And we will discuss these changes as they evolved in the creation of the Henry VIII portrait in a little bit, but just as a precursor to that, we can see we discussed the changes from the preparatory drawing of Lady Guilford to the finished drawing of Lady Guilford. We see in the preparatory drawing that her eyes were cut to the side and her face had a slight smile of expression on it. In the final portrait, her face is full on to the viewer with less expression. Not much changed in the portrait itself or even the shape of the face, except for just the slight change in the direction of the eyes. The same thing, the same technique was used as Holbein honed the image of Henry VIII. In the earlier portrait with the blue background, as we've discussed, Henry VIII is in slight profile and he is looking out of the edge of the portrait frame. In the Whitehall mural, and sort of the final and most recognizable representation of the king by Holbein, the king is looking straight on to the viewer. And if you look closely at the shape of the head, the shape of the face, there was not much of a change except for just the slight deviation of the direction of the gaze. A final comparison between the Guilford portraits and the Whitehall mural could be made in considering if the portraits were a pendant pair or not, and whether they were or not, the way that they were painted in a specific fashion that they could very easily be paired together. Obviously, Henry VIII and his wife, Jane Seymour, were painted together in the Whitehall mural. But this portrait that we've been looking at of Henry VIII also corresponds in some ways to other images that Hans Holbein created of Jane Seymour, and he created several of them of Jane Seymour. We will talk a little bit about that in a minute too. But Holbein may actually have adapted the pairing of Henry and Jane Seymour in the wall painting to later make, after the fact, diptych images of the king and queen together. No such diptych survives today, although this image of Henry VIII shown here it's a fairly small image, much smaller than his image in the wall mural itself. The small scale suggests that it may once have formed half of a pairing, but then on the other side, there's no comparable image of Jane Seymour except that the way that she is painted in this portrait and in the wall mural itself and in other sketches that Holbein did of her fits very nicely as a pendant pair with this portrait of Henry VIII. The next painting from Hans Holbein that we will look at in comparison and as a precursor to the Whitehall mural and the portrait of Henry VIII is this piece, probably one of my personal favorite pieces in all of art history, and it's titled The Ambassadors, and it was created by Holbein in 1533. In this piece, we are looking at the French ambassador to England. His name is Jean de Denville, and he is dressed very elaborately in pink satin and a black satin gown trimmed with velvet and lined with lynx fur. On his right is Georges de Selve, Bishop of Lavar, who visited his friend Jean de Denville in England in the late spring of the year of 1533. The cleric presents a more sober aspect in his long brown damask robe, although the cloth he wears with its gigantic pattern is outstandingly luxurious and would have been highly expensive. There's an embossed decoration on de Denville's dagger that tells us that he is 29 years old, and there is an inscription on the book on which de Selve rests his arm that reveals he is 25 years old. And between the two men are shelves full of objects. Behind them is a green damask curtain, which at the top left-hand corner, very small, you have to look close to see it in this, the curtain has been drawn aside just enough to reveal a silver crucifix. And the two men stand on a pavement inlaid with colored marbles and an elaborate design, which includes within the design, oddly enough, a signature by Hans Holbein that he created this painting. And as I mentioned before, he very rarely does that. And then between them and below the shelves at a diagonal in the foreground is a long grayish shape, which is actually a distorted skull. So included in this painting, and most notably, I think, is the shelf of objects between the two men. And on this shelf, we see a celestial globe and a terrestrial globe, so a globe of the heavens and a globe of the earth. We see various mathematical equipment or mathematical tools on the top shelf, and then on the bottom shelf there is a German hymn book, and there's a case of flutes, and there's also a lute. These, I think, are important aspects to consider. First of all, this this painting was created in 1533, and significantly, that is the year of Anne Boleyn's coronation as Queen of England. Hans Holbein is of German descent, and the split between Henry VIII and the Catholic Church to create the Church of England um, created a alliance in a way with the teachings of Martin Luther, of German descent, and the introduction of Protestantism and Lutheranism in Europe. So the German hymnal could potentially represent either the artists or the sitters' sympathies with the creation of the Church of England and the split with Catholicism in this case. Similarly, the lute, and you probably can't see it in this image, but if you look at a very close-up um, detail of the lute, you will see that there's a broken string on the lute, which again could symbolize sort of the discord or the tensions that are happening at this time in England. What I think is most striking as a comparison of these two pieces, though, the ambassadors from 1533 and then the Whitehall mural of 1537, is their composition. So a comparison of the composition, I hope, can be seen pretty immediately. Um, of course, we've got a difference. We've got 2 figures versus 4 figures, but that these are unusual compositions that are centered around a central object, whether it's the tablet in the middle of the Whitehall mural or the shelves of objects in the middle of the ambassadors. But in addition to that, if we look at the poses of the 2 ambassadors and consider those in conjunction with Henry VII and Henry VIII in the Whitehall mural, we see some interesting comparisons. So we can see that de Selve is in a pose that mirrors Henry VII, with the arm resting up on the table and his hand kind of at his waist. And then we could compare de Denfil to Henry VIII, not only in kind of a mirror of the pose, holding a knife in his one hand and his other hand raised, whether it's on the shelf or on the belt, but also just the bulk and the immensity of these 2 figures in the pose. And then both of these men have that very same direct gaze directly out to the viewer. But another really interesting comparison between these 2 pieces is the point of view of the viewer. We talked a little bit earlier about the potential intended point of view of someone coming into this room at Whitehall and witnessing this mural, and that it was an illusionary mural, that you would have the feeling that as you walked into the room, you were standing in the room with these 4 royals, and that there were several techniques that Holbein actually imparted in the mural itself to add to that illusion, that the ceiling was designed in the mural to feel like it was a continuation of the actual ceiling in the room, that the decorations in the background were a continuation of the decorations within the room. But not only that, is that the mural was nearly, as we said, life-size. The figures in the mural are life-size. And while you walk into the room and you're looking up at the ceiling portion of the mural, the viewer is simultaneously looking down at the floor portion of the mural. The viewpoint of the feet of Henry VIII and the staircase that Henry VIII and Jane Seymour are standing on is actually below the viewer's viewpoint, which gives the illusion, again, of being on the same plane, and that when you walk into the room at a certain point, you have the illusion of standing in the room with these figures. The Ambassadors has a couple of similarities to this. Again, a nearly life-size portrait, and again, situated very similarly in scale to the viewer, in a point of view that you feel like you are on the same level as these figures. You are gazing directly at their faces, and you have the sensation of looking down at their feet below you. But even more, kind of in that illusionary point of view, is where this strange angled skull at the bottom of the Ambassadors comes in. And we can see with this piece and with how the skull is placed that a person would have to walk into the room where this particular painting is hanging at a certain angle to be able to see that that is actually a skull on the ground. They have to walk in at an angle to get the illusionary effect of this piece. Both of these illusionary effects are highly indicative of Holbein's skill as a painter, that he's able to create these illusions within these massive, massive paintings. And again, so the Ambassadors being created several years before the Whitehall mural, we can see these techniques in not only composition, but also in intent with the sitters as being a precursor to what would happen with the Whitehall mural. At this point, we should probably return to the details of the Whitehall mural itself and the creation of the imagery of Henry VIII that Holbein created with this portrait of the king. If we look to the chapter of Susan Foister's book that we are looking at to accompany this lecture, she very concisely summarizes that the entire purpose of this wall painting is that it was a celebration of the Tudor genealogy. It's a dynasty painting, as we said before, of the succession that passed from father to son, from Henry VII to Henry VIII. And this is described in the Latin verse that's on the tablet in the middle of the painting. And it describes them in this sort of heroic terms of Henry VII as bringing, establishing the dynasty and bringing peace to England. And then Henry VIII as overcoming the Pope and establishing the true religion of England, which actually kind of puts into question sort of who was more important to the dynasty at this point. And I think we could probably make the argument that, at least in Holbein's rendering, that it was the establishment of the Church of England by Henry VIII that was the outstanding characteristic of this king's reign. However, back to the idea that this is a dynasty painting, an interesting aspect to this painting is that Henry VIII was likely the only person alive when this painting was completed. Obviously, Henry VII and Henry's mother, Elizabeth of York, had passed on by the time this painting was conceived. But also the date of the painting, again, as established by the tablet in the center, is 1537. This date is important because it is the date that Jane Seymour gave birth to Henry's only legitimate male heir to the throne, to the Tudor throne. However, Jane Seymour also passed away due to complications of the childbirth shortly after their son was born. the question is, sort of at what point in 1537 was this mural created? Was this before uh, Edward, their son, was born, or was it after Edward, their son, was born? If it was before, that would have been risky for Henry VIII to have celebrated the continuation of the dynasty. He had had lots of attempts at having a legitimate male heir prior to the birth of Edward, none of whom survived. So we would think that Henry VIII would have waited at least far enough along in Jane's pregnancy that she would look pregnant in the image. Um, and if it was after the birth of the son and the heir to the Tudor throne was born, then that would mean that this painting was created after the death of Jane Seymour. Um, if we look at this, the painting really doesn't indicate either one of those time periods, which is interesting. So we'll look a little bit more at Jane Seymour herself to consider this. As we can see here, looking at this earlier portrait of Jane Seymour from 1536, a year earlier than the Whitehall mural, her portrait and her image in the Whitehall mural are virtually identical. Aside from costuming, um, there's not much difference between the look of these. And the portrait is also based off of an even earlier drawing sketch that Holbein did of Jane Seymour. So although the inscription does not mention the birth, it's difficult to believe, as I said earlier, that such a dynastic celebration would have been undertaken without knowledge of the pregnancy, and probably not until the safe delivery of the son. Um, so the wall painting could have therefore been completed early in 1537 before the pregnancy was evident, but it's also pretty likely that it was created after the Henry's son was born, and likely after the death of Jane Seymour, and that Jane's image in the mural was taken from the earlier portrait and drawings that Holbein had created of her. As interesting as Jane Seymour's timeline for inclusion in the Whitehall portrait is, it's really the evolution of Henry VIII himself in Holbein portraiture that is so important to this lecture, and what actually makes the overall quote-unquote image of Henry VIII that we know today. So we see here sort of the three versions of this image of Henry VIII that we've been looking at. The first is the portrait from around 1534 with the blue background. The second in the middle is, again, the preparatory sketch for the mural, which has similarities with both the earlier portrait and the finished mural, and then the finished mural itself. So no drawing actually survives for this earliest portrait, but it does most closely resemble the prep for the mural. In addition to the way that the king is facing with the partial profile looking out of the frame, the king is presented in clothing of mostly costly materials. His doublet and his sleeves are of cloth of silver, and the puff sleeves and his fur-lined coat are cloth of gold. So very expensive materials being shown in these portraits. In these images, Henry also wears a hat with brooches of pearls and other jewels and edged with soft white feathers. Um, the texture is indicated with soft smears of white paint. And around his neck, in both the early portrait and the sketch, he has a gold chain, of which is decorated with a series of H's for Henry in gold. Uh, and then numerous rubies fastening the uh, the silver doublé attract greater attention to his costuming. So despite the really elaborate costuming, the person himself, Henry VIII, is far from overwhelmed by the clothing that he's wearing. Um, the As Susan Foister says in her article, the strong diagonal of the brown leather glove held in the right hand is echoed by the partly visible left hand. It suggests not only his largesse, but this imminent movement that he has. Uh, Unlike the sketch in the sketch for the Whitehall portrait and the portrait itself, the earlier portrait is closed off. It doesn't quite show the bulk of the king because of the framing of the portrait itself. However, all of this put together with um, the costuming, the positioning, the technique of depicting the king himself, Holbein has already, in this early portrait, has compelled attention and respect for the king. As we move through this transition, we see that gets further exaggerated. We go from this closer-up portrait to this full-length sketch, which retains many of the elements of the earlier close-up portrait, but brings in this breadth and width of body, and then almost impossibly in the Whitehall mural itself, this becomes even more exaggerated. The costuming that the king is wearing creates an even broader expanse in his shoulders. And then the final change, the big change, is the head of Henry VIII himself. So Foister points out that Holbein didn't really arrive at these changes easily, and that the preparatory sketch for the final mural shows that it was made up in different pieces, and that a piece would be sketched and then maybe replaced later with another piece, another sketch, and particularly the head in significance was changed out. So it seems that perhaps Holbein tried out several different versions of the head and the face of Henry VIII before finally, at some stage, it appears that the three-quarter view that we've been looking at up until this point was changed to a frontal one that is seen in the final version, or at least the final version as we see in the copy that was made in the 17th century after what is presumably the 1537 actual mural. There actually, interestingly, there wasn't necessarily a need for Holbein to come back and ask the king to pose for another portrait to make this change for the mural. There are very few changes from the preparatory sketch to the mural itself, much in the way that we saw he changed the Lady Guildford mural, or the Lady Guildford painting earlier in the lecture. Not much changed except for the direction of the eyes and her expression. And even in this, as we look closely between the preparatory sketch and the final version in the mural, even though the gaze has completely changed, the shape of the head itself has changed very little. And it's just this very subtle change of a gaze of 3/4 out of the painting to a gaze that is full frontal on to the viewer. That really changes the entire perception of this figure, of the King of England. So the full face view was certainly less usual in portrait painting of individuals than the 3/4 view. Um, and Holbein's wall painting may well have been incredibly startling for people as they came in to see it. To see not just a figure gazing full on straight to the viewer, but also full body portrait, full body straight onto the viewer. This was a very revolutionary way to portray a figure in a portrait, and surely helped to ensure the imagery that we have still to this day of Henry VIII, thanks to this portrait of Holbein. Of Henry VIII. Also, interestingly, in the Whitehall mural, nobody else is in the mural depicted facing completely towards the viewer the way that Henry VIII is, which is interesting when we consider that he could have potentially been the only living member of the dynasty portrayed in the mural. I mentioned earlier that the full-on direct gaze of a sitter was a particular pose that fascinated Holbein as an artist. But it is also quite possible that it fascinated the king as well, and could lead to hints as to why he would want his portrait in the Whitehall mural portrayed like that. It seemed that the king felt that this direct gaze, this full-on gaze, was able to show not only the individuality of a person and their power, but also required perfection, both physically and in character, to be able to be portrayed in this way, which is interesting when we think after the Whitehall mural, as Henry VIII moved on from the death of Jane Seymour and began searching for his next wife, and employed Holbein again in this search, that he at this point actually sent Holbein out into the world to document potential brides, potential next queens. And we can see that as he sent Holbein out to do this, that preferred pose of both the king and the artist was used at least twice in this process of finding the next queen. So here we see two portraits painted by Holbein. The first is Christina of Denmark from 1538, and the second is Anne of Cleves from around 1539. Both of these portraits were painted in the process of Henry VIII looking for his next wife. And both of these portraits have interesting stories behind them. But if we remember, Henry VIII is looking for not just individuality and potential power in a wife, but perfection in physical appearance and perfection in character. So if we start with the portrait that Holbein painted of Christina of Denmark, she's actually Italian. She's from Milan, but she was a widower herself when this portrait was painted, hence her being dressed completely in black. Um, but it is rumored that when Holbein came to paint her portrait as a potential suitor or as a potential wife for the King of England, um, that she is notoriously rumored as have saying, I would gladly uh, give myself to the King of England if only I had two heads to spare. Um, Apparently, Henry VIII was very enamored with this portrait and kept it with him, even after the potential betrothment did not work out. The second portrait, which is Anne of Cleves, Anne actually did become Henry's fourth wife. And this portrait is very interesting because when Henry VIII saw the portrait, he became very enamored with Anne of Cleves. um, and based off of Holbein's rendering of Anne of Cleves alone on this beautiful, um, very stoic, very calm, again, straight on frontal view of a woman that conveys everything that Henry would want to know about her. He was presented with the portrait and um, and entered into a contract to marry her based on the portrait. When Anne of Cleves arrived in England, they had already been contracted to be married, and for various reasons, when Henry VIII saw Anne in person, um, there was absolutely no attraction, and in fact, there was almost a, a repulsion on the part of the king's uh, behalf towards Anne of Cleves. What is fascinating is that Holbein, as the artist, um, although it was said that he did not depict her truthfully, there were no repercussions to Holbein for uh, Henry VIII being contracted into this marriage. Um, However, there were repercussions for Thomas Cromwell, who was Henry VIII's um, prime advisor at the time, and who was also very much pushing the agenda of further Lutheran ties, and uh, very much was in promotion of Henry VIII entering into a marriage contract with Anne of Cleves. This was basically the undoing for Cromwell, whereas Holbein, even though it was his image of her that sort of duped the king into marrying her, got off without really any kind of repercussions. Interestingly, Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves were able to quickly annul their marriage on the basis that they never consummated the marriage. And Anne of Cleves was perfectly happy at that point to stay in England and stayed in England and became a de facto sister of Henry VIII and lived a very happy life in England, being set aside as his wife and keeping her head. And they had a very cordial relationship beyond that. And the final Holbein portrait for us to look at in consideration of understanding the image of Henry VIII as presented in the Whitehall mural is this. This is Holbein's portrait of Edward, Prince of Wales, created around 1539. He would have been about 2 years old, and Edward was, of course, the son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. So this is sort of the image of the third leg of the dynasty of the Whitehall mural that we don't actually see in the mural itself. It's not referenced in the mural in any way, except the fact that the mural is a representation of the dynasty of the Tudors. We have Henry VII, we have Henry VIII, and presumably either on the way or already born was Edward, Prince of Wales, who would be the next future King of England, albeit for a very short time before he also passed on. But interestingly, again, looking at both Holbein and Henry VIII's interest in that full-on frontal view in a portrait to convey both um, uh, perfection in physicality and perfection in character, and to show individuality and power. Here we have this young 2-year-old heir to the throne of England presented in a similar manner. And I would argue that this is actually one of Hans Holbein's most stunning portraits. At this point, he seems to have really perfected those elements that he brought together, beginning with his early commission for Henry Guilford, all the way through to the ambassadors and to his various iterations of portraits of Henry VIII to this, which really is, I think, the most stunning imagery from the Tudor dynasty. So it is, as Susan Foister says, in its power and novelty that Holbein's image of the king in the Whitehall mural had the potential to be an official portrait, one which was intended to be widely distributed, both geographically and in various media, and to supersede all royal images. It should have been a visual message to convey to the world that the realm of England had become an empire, this dynastic portrait that shows 3 generations of Tudor royalty on the throne in England. However, there is actually no evidence to suggest that any individual portraits of Henry VIII by Holbein or anybody else were commissioned out of a desire to present a particular type of public image, which conformed to any kind of approved likeness or that had a significant role to play in performing public images of a king, which is really kind of mind-boggling. That a king in the position of Henry VIII, who was so interested in and so passionate about establishing this dynasty and being this leader in the world, that he never actually officially commissioned a royal portrait, and that he didn't make any of the portraits that Holbein created his official court portrait. So it's very interesting. It's almost a very internal kind of representation of this dynasty, which was ultimately probably the most important thing to Henry VIII, that he had a male heir. However, in consideration of that, despite the fact that it wasn't necessarily intended by the king to be an official portrait, what finally ended up being this version of Henry VIII in the Whitehall mural has become the image of Henry VIII that most recognize as being the image of Henry VIII. And in fact, as we look at other images of Henry VIII that came after the Whitehall mural, we see over and over again the same similarities used, the same pose, the elaborate costuming, that full frontal, very broad-shouldered pose. as we see in both of these images, one from the workshop of Holbein from probably about the same time that the mural was created, and this other that was commissioned about 25 to 30 years after the mural was created. And we can see that again, over and over, that this is the way that you portray Henry VIII. And even that very first image that I had of Henry VIII at the intro of this lecture was in fact a probably Spanish copy of those same types of characteristics that Holbein established in the Whitehall mural. So I hope that you were able to see how the elements of Holbein's career in England came together to form the image of Henry VIII that we have come to know today. Thank you.